Montana Territory, June 1883. The train hissed to a stop in the dusty little town of Red Rock, its iron wheels screeching like a wounded beast. The sun beat down on the platform, and the air shimmered with heat rising off the tracks. Travelers stepped down in a slow trickle, some wide-eyed with hope, others guarded by weariness. Among them was a young woman in a lilac traveling dress, her gloved hands trembling as she held a worn carpet bag to her chest. Her name was Tessa Calloway, and her whole life had just fit into that one small bag. She stepped down from the train with a stiff spine, her eyes scanning the waiting crowd with growing dread. No one was holding a sign. No one stepped forward with a smile. She looked again, heart pounding. Her intended husband, a man she had exchanged 14 letters with and promised herself to, was nowhere in sight. The platform tilted beneath her. The heat, the fear, the long journey, the dashed hope, all of it crashed down at once. Tessa fainted. She barely registered the strong arms that caught her before she hit the boards. "Easy now," a deep voice said near her ear. "You are all right. I got you." When her eyes fluttered open, she was lying on a bench in the shade, a man's coat folded beneath her head. A tall cowboy crouched beside her, worry etched into the lines around his blue eyes. His shirt was sun-faded, his hat dusty, but he had the look of a man who worked hard and meant what he said. His voice was soft, but steady. "You fainted," he said. "Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head, trying to sit up. "No, I was supposed to meet someone, Mr. Illy Jessup. He was meant to be here." His jaw tightened just slightly. "You are the mail-order bride," she nodded, her cheeks red. "Yes." "I am Tessa Calloway." The cowboy pressed his lips together, then extended one hand. "Kade Collins." She took it, her fingers trembling in his. "You are not him." "No," Kade said, "but I heard about him. Jessup skipped town 2 days ago, left behind a stack of gambling debts and a busted promise." "I am sorry you came all this way for nothing, Miss Calloway." The words hit like a slap. She turned her face away, blinking hard. "I have no place to go." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood and offered his hand again. "Come with me. You can rest at my place." "I will not leave you here alone." She hesitated, her pride bristling, but the street was empty now, and she had no money left, no letters to send, no home to return to. Finally, she nodded. Kade's ranch was 2 miles out, and he hitched his horse to a small wagon he used for hauling feed. She sat beside him, the wind tugging at her bonnet, the silence stretching between them. He did not ask questions, did not pry. He just offered her a canteen when she looked faint again, and slowed the horse when she seemed too rattled by the ride. The ranch was modest but sturdy, a small house, a barn, a corral with 2 horses and a few cows. Kade helped her down from the wagon and guided her to the front porch. "I live alone," he said. "No wife, no housekeeper, just me and some stubborn livestock. But it is clean, and there is a bed you can use until you figure out where you want to go." She looked up at him, her throat tight. "Why are you helping me?" he shrugged. "Because you needed it." Inside, the cabin was cooler, the light soft through the curtains. Kade brought her a plate of cold beans and bread, then stepped outside to give her space. She ate slowly, her hands still shaking. Her whole life had been uprooted in one moment, and yet somehow she was not alone. That night, she sat on the porch bench wrapped in a borrowed quilt, watching the stars spill across the sky. Kade joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. "You from Boston, right?" he asked. "Yes," she said softly. "My parents passed 3 years ago. I worked as a seamstress until the shop closed." "There was nothing left," he nodded. "I lost my pa to a logging accident. Ma passed last winter, been on my own since." They sat in silence, the kind that was not awkward but gentle. He watched the stars. She watched his profile. He had a quiet strength about him, something grounding. "I never thought I would end up like this," she said. He looked at her then. "Maybe it is not the end. Maybe it is just the start." The days passed in a quiet rhythm. Tessa stayed in the guest room and helped wash dishes, sweep dust, and feed the chickens. Kade never hovered but always made sure she had what she needed. He never made her feel like a burden. One afternoon, she found him gently stitching a broken saddle strap in the barn, sleeves rolled up, sweat at his temples. She watched from the doorway, heart skipping. He was kind, steady, strong. And not once had he treated her like she was something to be pitied. "Kade," she said, stepping inside. He looked up. "You never asked me what I plan to do next." "No," he said, setting the strap aside. "Because I did not want to push you." She twisted her hands. "I do not have a plan. But I know I do not want to leave." He stood slowly, eyes searching hers. "You saying you might want to stay here, with me?" Tessa's voice was quiet but sure. "Yes." He stepped closer, his voice low. "I have no fancy words, but I have land, a home. I would treat you right. If you want it." She felt the tears rise, but they were not sad ones. She gave a small nod. "I want it." Kade reached for her hand and held it between his calloused palms. "Then stay, Tessa, be my wife. We will build something good here. Together." She smiled, the sun catching her hair, her heart light for the first time in years. "Yes, Kade, I will." And for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt safe. She felt home. The first hard rain swept over the valley 5 days after Tessa agreed to stay. The sky had been brewing it all morning, dark clouds pressing low against the hills. When the downpour began, Kade was still out stringing new fence wire. She stood at the window and watched him work through it, soaked through, boots sunk deep in the mud. He didn't look up once, just kept tugging the line taut, shoulders tight with focus. By sundown, wet clothes hung near the fire and the scent of wood smoke filled the cabin. Tessa ladled stew into 2 tin bowls, her sleeves rolled, her hands steady now with purpose. He came in with a quiet nod, hair dripping, face streaked with rain and dirt. She handed him a towel before he spoke. "Fence held," he said. "North post was near, rotted through, had to dig a new hole." She set the bowls on the table. "You didn't stop for dinner. Didn't want to lose light." He sat across from her, shoulders hunched slightly as he ate. The only sounds were the ticking of rain on the windows and the scrape of spoons against tin. They ate without hurry. Afterward, she poured hot water into a basin and set it on the table with a rag. He glanced at her, then dipped his hands in and started scrubbing the grime from his fingers. "You ever mend canvas?" he asked, not looking up. "No," she said. "But I'm a quick learner. Got a tear in the wagon cover, I'll show you how." She nodded, brushing a strand of damp hair from her forehead. "Kade, do you ever get tired of being alone?" He rinsed his hands and wiped them dry. "Don't reckon I thought much about it. Quiet's always been easier. But not better." His eyes met hers. "Better's what you make of things." That night, she lit the lamp early. The storm showed no signs of easing, and the wind sighed through the cracks along the window frame. Tessa sat in the rocker and began stitching the wagon cover where Kade had marked it. The canvas was stiff beneath her needle, but the rhythm steadied her. Kade worked across the room, shaping a new handle for the barn door latch. The fire cast long shadows on the walls, and the cabin felt smaller with both of them moving inside it, but not cramped, just filled. "Tessa," he said without turning, "you ever ride?" "Not well. Not since I was a girl." He set the knife down. "We'll change that." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I'd like to show you the ridgeline. You can see the whole valley from there." The idea settled in her chest like a promise. The next morning the sun returned. The storm had passed but left the earth soft and the sky scrubbed clean. Kade saddled the gentler of his 2 horses and walked it to the yard. Tessa waited on the porch, hair braided, skirt tied up at the hem. He helped her mount, his hands firm at her waist. She didn't flinch this time. They rode slowly, the trail narrow and winding. Tessa held the saddle horn tight, her breath shallow at each incline. Kade rode ahead, glancing back often, his voice calm. Lean forward a bit on the steeper part. That's it. She followed his lead, each movement building trust in the animal and in herself. At the top, the land opened wide before them, miles of low hills, the creek glinting in the sun, the wind stirring the tall grass like water. Tessa drew a breath. It's beautiful. He dismounted and helped her down. It's home. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the breeze cool against their faces. She turned to him. I don't want to be just another burden you took in. You're not, he said, quiet but firm. You're the first thing that's felt right in a long while. She didn't say anything, but she reached for his hand and he didn't let go. They rode back slower, the silence between them no longer unfamiliar. That evening, she brought out a length of muslin she'd found in a trunk beside the bed and began sketching out a curtain pattern for the kitchen window. Kade watched her from the doorway, arms crossed, a faint crease between his brows. You aiming to stay for good, then? She didn't look up. I haven't changed my mind. He nodded once, then stepped forward and leaned down to brush a kiss against her temple. That night, when she blew out the lamp, she did it with a heart that no longer felt like it was waiting for anything. The first Sunday passed with quiet reverence. Tessa rose early and dressed in a navy calico gown she'd found folded in a trunk, the seams slightly loose but serviceable. She tied her hair back at the nape and stepped onto the porch, where Kade was oiling the hinges on the barn door. He paused when he saw her. You look ready for something. I was hoping we might ride into town, she said, smoothing her sleeve. There's a chapel there, isn't there? He straightened with a nod. There is. Small but good-hearted folks. The ride in was slower this time, not out of caution but ease. They passed fields of prairie flax just beginning to bloom, the petals pale blue beneath the warming sun. Tessa kept one hand lightly on the saddle horn, more for habit than need. Kade rode beside her, glancing toward the horizon now and again like he always did, as if he was still learning how to trust calm skies. When they reached Red Rock, the chapel was already filling. The building was plain, with whitewashed boards and a slanted roof, but the stained glass above the door caught the light in a way that made Tessa pause. Inside, they sat near the rear. A woman in a straw bonnet leaned over and whispered her name. Kade gave a small nod in return but didn't offer more. After the final hymn, Tessa lingered by the door. A young boy was ringing the bell with both hands, his boots barely touching the floor each time he swung forward. She smiled at the sight. You thinkin' of staying long? Asked a gray-haired woman with a weathered face and a warm gaze. Tessa folded her hands. I believe I am. Well then, the woman said, we'll be glad for a new set of hands come harvest. Kade joined her outside, leading the horses toward the hitch rail. She followed without a word. On the ride back, the hills felt less distant. The wind didn't tug so hard at her bonnet. That afternoon, she sorted through the neglected garden plot behind the house. The soil was dry in patches but held firm beneath the surface. She found a rusted spade leaning against the shed and began working the earth in slow rows. Her palms blistered before the sun reached its peak. Kade approached with a tin cup of water. You're planting. Not today, she said, pausing to wipe her brow with her sleeve. But I wanted to see what was possible. He crouched beside her and ran his fingers through the turned soil. You think it'll take, she nodded. With care, yes. He looked at the furrowed rows. Never had much luck with it. Ma used to say I had the touch of a jackrabbit. Tessa smiled faintly. Then I'll plant. And you can build that fence you've been putting off near the chicken yard." He exhaled through his nose, amused but didn't argue. That evening she found him fitting new hinges to the chicken coop. She sat nearby on a split log, her hands resting on her lap. "I want to know what your mother was like," she said. He didn't stop working. "She was plain-spoken, could skin a deer faster than my pa could saddle a horse, but she sang while she worked, never the same song twice." Tessa watched his hands move, careful and sure. "You miss her?" "Every day," he said without pause. She nodded, letting the silence settle again. A week passed, then another. The cabin began to change in small ways. Tessa stitched new muslin curtains for the bedroom. Kade built a shelf for her books. She planted seeds along the garden rows. Beans, onions, a few rows of squash. He cleared the brush near the back fence without being asked. One afternoon, as the heat stretched across the land and the chickens dozed in the dust, Kade came to her in the garden. "I need to ride into Miles City tomorrow," he said, brushing soil from her sleeve with the back of his hand. "To register the land again. It's been a while." She nodded. "I'll pack you food. I want you to come." She looked up. "It's a long ride. Longer alone." She studied his face, then stood and dusted off her apron. "All right." They rode out before dawn. The trail was longer than the way to Red Rock, weaving through hilly stretches where the trees grew taller and the scent of pine thickened. They camped halfway, near a dry creek bed. Kade pitched the canvas and started a fire. Tessa unwrapped the bread and cheese she'd packed and handed him half. As the fire crackled low, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folded paper. "What's that?" she asked. "Land deed," he said. "Been in my name since Pa passed." She waited. "I want to add yours to it." Her breath caught. "You don't have to, I know," he said, "but I want to." She stared at the fire for a long moment before answering. "Then yes." He didn't reach for her then. He simply leaned back, the quiet between them steady and full. That night, the stars were sharp and bright above the canvas. Tessa lay awake beside him, not touching, just listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing. There was no fear in the dark now. Only the sound of a man who'd held her when she collapsed, who'd never asked for anything but gave without hesitation. A man who offered soil, sky, and his name without condition. And somewhere between the hush of the wind and the crackle of cooling embers, she knew she loved him. Not because he'd saved her, but because he'd seen her and stayed. The courthouse in Miles City stood square and sun-bleached at the edge of a wide, packed street where freight wagons rattled by, and men in dust-covered coats leaned against storefronts with their hats tipped low. Kade tied the horses to a rail beside the hardware store and helped Tessa down without a word. She adjusted her skirt and followed him past the livery, past the post office, and into a building that smelled of ink and old paper. Inside, a clerk with spectacles perched low on his nose took Kade's deed with a grunt and slid it across a blotter. He didn't look at Tessa until Kade spoke again. "She'll be signing it, too." Only then did the man blink and reach for another pen. Tessa signed her name in smooth, careful strokes. When it was done, Kade folded the document and slipped it into his coat. Outside, the air was heavy with heat. Tessa shaded her eyes and looked down the street. "You need anything else in town?" she asked. Kade considered. "A spare bit for the gray. And you ought to have a proper pair of boots if you're set on gardening." She followed him without hesitation. They found what they needed at a shop run by a woman with deep creases around her mouth and a red ribbon tied at her collar. She measured Tessa's feet with a twine string and brought out a pair with firm heels and stitched leather that smelled of tannin and smoke. "Won't be easy on your arches at first," the woman said, "but they'll hold up." "They'll do," Tessa answered. On their way back to the wagon, they passed a man selling hand pies from a wooden crate lined with muslin. Kade bought 2 apple and gooseberry and handed one to her without asking. They ate beneath the shade of a cottonwood growing beside the general store. Tessa watched a group of children chasing a hoop between wagon wheels and puddles from the last rain. Her fingers were sticky with fruit when she turned to him. "You think you'll ever leave Montana?" He wiped his mouth with the edge of his sleeve. "No, not even to see something else. A city. The ocean. I've seen enough to know I'm meant for wide land and quiet skies. I wouldn't trade it for noise." She nodded slowly. "I think I'm beginning to understand that." They started for home near mid-afternoon, the sun lowering just enough to cast long shadows across the hills. Tessa rode with a firm seat now, her shoulders relaxed, her hands light on the reins. She didn't ask how far they had left. She didn't need to. The land was no longer unfamiliar, and the trail felt like it belonged to her as much as it did to Kade. Back at the cabin, the chickens rustled in the coop, and the smell of pine smoke drifted from the chimney. Kade went to unhitch the horses while Tessa brought in the parcel of boots and the last of the dried apples she'd bartered for in town. That evening, while Kade tended the fire, Tessa sat at the table with an old sheet of ledger paper and began sketching a pattern for a harvest apron. She worked by lamplight, the pencil faint against the paper. He spoke without looking up. "There's a man coming by next week. I hired him to help clear the South Acre." She paused. "Are you thinking of planting something, wheat?" he said. "Just a small patch. If we get a good rain in July, it might take." She folded the paper and set it aside. "I can manage the house if you're out there most days." "I know you can," he said. "That's not why I told you." She waited. "I told you because I want you to know what I'm building, and I want you to have a hand in it." Tessa stood and crossed to the hearth. She sat beside him, folding her hands in her lap. "Then tell me what you see, Kade, when you look ahead." He rested his elbows on his knees, eyes on the fire. "I see a barn with a proper roof, a second room added to the house, maybe a porch all the way around. And someone in the kitchen, humming like my mother used to." She smiled, but didn't speak. "I see you there," he added. "Not just passing through, not a guest. You." When she reached for his hand, he held it without hesitation. His thumb brushed her knuckles, rough and warm. "I never wanted to belong anywhere," she said. "Not after losing everything, but now I do." Kade looked over, his voice low. "Then stay mine." "I already am." She leaned into him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. The wind whispered at the doorframe, soft and unhurried. The fire settled with a long sigh of embers. They sat there together while the night deepened. Nothing rushed, nothing uncertain. Only the steady warmth of 2 people who had chosen one another, and a future that, for the first time, felt like it truly belonged to them both. By late August, the wheat had pushed up through the soil in neat, stubborn lines. It wasn't tall yet, but it was green and upright, and that was enough for Kade to call it a start. The South Acre, once a patch of tangled scrub, now bore the simple, promising look of land that had been claimed by hand and hope. He stood at the edge of it one evening, a shovel resting against his shoulder, and watched the wind move through the stalks as if it, too, had been waiting for something to take root. Tessa came out from the house with a pail of water, her boots dusted and her apron tied at the back. She didn't call to him, just walked to his side and offered the pail. "You didn't stop to drink all afternoon," she said, brushing her fingers along the rim once he took it. He drank, then handed it back. "The soil's holding better than I figured." She glanced over the field. "It's coming up straight. That counts for something." "I don't know much about raising wheat," he said, "but I figure if it grows half as steady as you've got those beans climbing the trellis, we'll be all right." Tessa smiled, but her eyes stayed on the far edge of the land. "What happens if the frost comes early? Then we try again come spring," he said. "Nothing worth keeping comes easy." She nodded slowly, then looked up at him. "Have you written to the land office about the boundaries yet?" "Did last week," he said. "Marked everything from the creek bend to the old deer trail. They'll send someone out before winter." She let out a breath, quiet but contented. "It's strange," she said, "to feel settled." He reached for her free hand, his grip warm and sure. "Does it feel wrong?" "No," she said. "It feels like I've found something I didn't know I was missing." They walked back toward the house together, the sun dipping low behind the hills. Inside, a kettle sat warm on the stove, and the scent of wild mint hung in the air. Tessa unpinned her apron and folded it over the chair, then turned to Kade. "I had a thought," she said. "There's a widow in town, Mrs. Harlan. She keeps bees. Says she's too old to keep climbing the ladder to check the hives. She asked if I'd be willing to help her in exchange for a few jars of honey." He sat down on the bench and nodded. "You want to?" "I do. I think it might be good to have something of my own, small as it is." Kade leaned back slightly. "Then I'll ride you in. And if she's the sort to talk too long, I'll wait nearby and give you an excuse to leave." Tessa laughed, light and easy. "She can talk the ears off a mule. But her honey's worth it." That night, as the lantern burned low, Kade reached for the leather-bound calendar he kept tucked in the top drawer of the cupboard. He flipped past the months until he found an empty corner in September. Carefully, he wrote a single word in ink: vows. The next morning, he saddled the horse before she woke and rode into Red Rock alone. When he returned, the sun was just past its peak, and Tessa was hanging linens along the back fence. He dismounted, walked to her, and reached into his coat pocket. She turned, drying her hands on her skirt. "What's this?" He opened his palm. Inside was a narrow silver ring, the band simple, the surface polished but unadorned. "I couldn't offer much," he said, "but I wanted something that would last." Tessa took the ring carefully, her eyes searching his. "You want to make it legal. I want to make it right," he said. "Not because of what happened before, not because you stayed, but because I want to build the rest of this life with you, every day, every season." She looked down at the ring for a long moment, then slipped it on her finger. "Then let's make it right." They were married in the chapel 2 Sundays later, standing beneath the same stained glass window that had caught the light on their first visit. The service was short, the pews half filled with folks from town misses. Harlan, the storekeeper's wife, the blacksmith who'd helped fix Kade's plow blade. No one made speeches. No one fussed afterward. They rode home slow, side by side. The clouds hung low, promising rain but giving none. At the cabin, Tessa stepped into the kitchen and untied her bonnet. "Will it feel different now?" she asked. Kade hung his coat on the peg and crossed to her. "It already does." He kissed her, then slow, certain, without ceremony, just the quiet truth of it. Her hands found the collar of his shirt, and she leaned into him, the warmth of the room folding around them like a second skin. Time passed, as it always did. Snow came early that winter, and the wheat never reached full height, but they'd expected that. Kade built a cold frame for her herbs, and she kept the house warm with stitching and tea and stories traded with neighbors over borrowed books. By the second spring, the south field bore better yield, and Tessa's jar of honey from Mrs. Harlan sat on a shelf beside a row of canned beans, each one labeled in her hand. They added a second cow to the pasture and 2 more hens. Kade built the porch she'd once imagined, and Tessa lined it with pots of lavender and sage. On an evening in June, she stood at the edge of the garden, her dress brushing the tops of the new shoots. Kade came up behind her, circling his arms around her waist. "Think we'll ever leave this place?" she asked. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Only if the land gives out. And even then, I'd carry the dirt with me just to bring you home again." She turned in his arms, pressing her forehead to his. "You don't have to say things like that." "I don't," he said. "I just mean them." They stayed out until the sky turned dark and the stars blinked through the dusk. The house behind them stood quiet and sure, the windows glowing soft with lamplight. The land stretched wide around them, weathered, worked, and full of promise. And in the middle of it, two people who had found not rescue, not salvation, but something steadier. The quiet, enduring work of love and the life they'd chosen to build with it. Forever, exactly where they were.